Well, hi there, friends. It is Mindy Odlin on this What If Wednesday. Thank you so much for being here, for being part of our community, for being a What If Upper and bringing hope and possibility to the world. Our mission for the What If Up Club, we are here as uplifters. We are here to elevate humanity by spreading hope, building connection, and inspiring positive change. And that's what today is about. So I want to talk about some bad news. Okay. This idea, the whole idea of bad news. So this week, actually, end of last week, we got the word about the monarch butterflies that we love so much. My daughter actually works at the butterfly house at Paul Smith College, and I volunteer there in the butterfly garden. And we love our butterflies, love our butterflies. And word came out last week that the monarchs, who are just incredible creatures, are now on the endangered species list. So that was the bad news that landed in our household. And what followed that bad news was the processing of the bad news and looking at, is it bad news or is it maybe something else that we can decide? So that's what today is about, is when you get news, when you find something out and it occurs to you as being bad and negative, what happens? There was a lot of emotion. There was a lot of, response to that in our household. And this was about, okay, let's process that. We don't want to gloss over that. And to look at what are the thoughts underlying that. And what if we could use our imagination to create the perspective? We could create a shift in the way we see things so that what we initially perceive as bad news, what if we could transform it and find hope in it? And why is that so important? Well, it's so important because when we get bad news and we go down that spiral of, it's like if we stay stuck at the bottom of that spiral. Now, obviously, when we get bad news, we're going to respond to that, right? Because what is that telling us? It's telling us that there's something that we want that is not manifesting. That's what bad news is, isn't it? There's something that I want. I want a healthy planet. I want monarch butterflies for generations and generations to come. There's something that I want, and what I'm perceiving is not that. And that's what bad news is, isn't it? It's contrast. And the great thing about contrast is that it can give us more clarity on what we want. The other great thing about contrast is sometimes it feels so awful that it gets us to take actions that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise done. Now, here's the challenge with that. If we only react when there's contrast, if we only react to the bad news, then we find ourselves going up and down the spiral. Like, okay, it's awful, but what can I do? And then we do something, and then we get the next bad news. We don't do anything unless there's bad news. And if we get into a culture or a society, and I think there's a lot of us there, where the only time that we respond to something is when there is a crisis, is when there's an endangered species. It's when it's like so big and so loud that we finally are like, wow, okay, now what's the crisis that I focused on now? And so we're constantly reacting to the bad news. But what if there's another way to see it? What if anytime we perceive something as, okay, that's not great news to me, that's not the outcome that I want, what if that gives us clarity of what's important to us? And what if we then take that news and use our imagination, use the power of what if to look for what is my next inspired action related to this topic, right? So that's what we did. After we processed the initial response to the news, my daughter and I, we did some what if upping. And we looked at, what if, because it's now an endangered species, what if it now gets protection? What if it now has more people planting milkweed, more people planting pollinator gardens, less people using fertilizers and doing things? What if it brings some awareness to what we need to do as human beings to create a planet that is healthy for all? And what if it reinvigorates a movement for creating a healthy, sustainable planet. So we just did some what if upping to see, like, what if this news isn't bad news? What if it is actually good news? What if this is a tipping point? What if this is changing things? Now, the key with what if upping is it doesn't stop there. It's like, oh, good, I feel better. Now I'm going to keep doing that same thing I've always done before. Right. So that's the thing, is once we become aware of something, we become aware of a desire, and we see what's showing up is not that. Now we get creative on what is mine to do to create that, to bridge that gap from where I am to where I want to be. So it brought to mind this quote, and it's a famous Shakespeare quote. You probably have heard it before. Shakespeare writes in Hamlet, he writes, there is no good or bad, but your thinking makes it so. There's no such thing as good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And as I was kind of looking at this quote, I've heard this quote before, and I think it's a great quote in terms of positive thinking. It kind of reminds me of the Wayne Dyer quote, which is my favorite Wayne Dyer quote. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So we know that there's a lot to be said for perspective. And I was looking at this Shakespeare quote and looking at it in the context of what was happening in Hamlet when Hamlet spoke those words. There is no good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And what I realized, what I learned is that in Hamlet, so the character is being greeted by friends who are like, "Hey, how's it going?" And it's Hamlet's like, "It's not so hot. I'm imprisoned essentially in this land where I don't want to be." And he also is referring to that he's imprisoned by the knowledge that he has, that now he has to do something with it. And that's why he feels like, he says, he was in Denmark. He said, Denmark is a prison. And they're like, well, if Denmark's a prison, then the whole world's a prison. And he says, well, it's thinking makes it so. There is no good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And it was his thought process. It was what was his mental awareness that felt like a prison to him. I think for our world that we live in today, we know a lot. We have a lot of awareness around things that are not the way we think they should be, right? That's sort of the downside of having access to information so easily, is we have this vision of the world that we want, and then we're constantly getting these messages about how it's not that, how reality is not that utopia that we can imagine. But what if that's actually good news? What if the fact that we have this awareness and we see the gap is not that we're being bombarded with bad news, but what if that's actually good news, because it's letting us see the gap so that we can change, so that we can do something different, so that we can be inspired to try a new way. So that is the possibility for this What If Wednesday, is to look at the things that maybe when you first hear them or see the headline or respond, that it feels like, oh, that's not good news. What if we could, again, honor those emotions, be grateful that they're there because they are guiding us to greater clarity of what we want, and then use that as the launching point for using our imagination to shift our perspective, to see, how can I use this for good? When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And one of the things that is most challenging when you are creating is when you go down those spirals, that is the least productive place to be. And so there's nothing wrong with going down there. Obviously, we're going to go down there when we see something that's unwanted. But how quickly can we turn it around? How quickly can we see what the possibilities are and align our actions so that we can move towards that desired outcome? So that's the food for thought for this week. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know, what are your thoughts when you change the way you look at things? The things you look at change. How have you used that idea in your own life? And what are some possibilities for responding to those times when maybe what we see is not exactly what we want? How do we turn that around? What if we get very proficient at noticing when we start moving down that spiral? What if every time we start moving down that spiral, we take a moment to stop and to breathe and to activate our imagination, to see possibilities, to see how we can use where we are in our current awareness, the reality that we're in, how can I create from here? If these are my building tools for the future, what will I do with them? And what if we align with each other when we get stuck? What if we reach out for help and support when we have a hard time turning that spiral around? And what if by coming to the creative process with joy and resourcefulness, we are actually able to turn those things around and create a better future for ourselves, for our communities, for the butterflies, for all of the creatures on this beautiful, beautiful planet that we live on. So, what if we have a fantastic week creating solutions to the things that are showing up as challenges, as problems? What if we use all of them as a springboard for creating something magnificent? Thank you for being part of our What If Up community. If you're not a member yet, you can go to whatifup.org and sign up. We would love to have you in our community as we discuss things. And you can share your challenges, share your comments, share your what you're working on, share what's come up for you and how you're processing through it. And we are here to support you and to what if up positive, uplifting possibilities with you. Thanks for being here. Have a great week, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.